My name's Ian Hingley. I'm a landscape architect and urban designer, and I'm from a consultancy called Urban Movement. So I'm going to talk about verges, grass verges and planted verges. And I think the importance of this phenomenon, this piece of, if you like, street infrastructure in our cities is that it enables us to establish a very substantial street tree cover. So the verge, if you look at this aerial photograph here, planting in the city or tree cover, vegetation cover in the city, often occurs in either formal squares you see up in the top left-hand corner, or in parks in the bottom right-hand corner. But a very important area in which we can establish this vegetation cover is in the streets as well. So if you look at Rosebery Avenue through here, you end up with this very dense canopy of foliage, and I don't know if we're all familiar, I think, with the importance of vegetation in the city and what it can do for climate change and water and heat island effect and water groundwater mitigation, things like that. So what I'm trying to do is to really advocate the idea that we reintroduce verges into urban centres. Now, when we think about verges, I think what we think about first is the suburban verge. We have a grass verge that has trees in it. But there are also instances in our more intensely used urban centres, this is Hackney, where we also have grass verges, and that allows us to do other things as well, either to plant trees in them, but they have a sort of, they have a multiple benefit, if you like. I started thinking about this topic because this is my street in Islington, and I walked out into my street and realised that the old grass verge had been concreted over. The tree had survived, but the verge itself had gone. I was curious about this phenomenon of the fact that probably back in the 1960s we started concreting over our grass verges in all our cities. And when I went on my travels to a study trip to Copenhagen, I noticed that almost by default, all their streets and all their footways had these verges on them. They weren't often grassed, these were gravelled, but it's where they planted the trees. The same in Paris. You go to Paris, every single street has a verge, and it's this self-binding gravel material, and in that are trees and also other components of street furniture. So you end up getting your lamppost, your seats, your litter bins, your bollards, all within this verge environment. Again, in Italy, Udine, this very intensely used high street which links the station to the town centre, has a verge with it. And again, it deals with all those things that we'd expect it to deal with, which is the placement of all the street furniture and the tree planting. And of course, what tends to happen is that the water that falls on the footway and drains towards the channel line on the gullies in the road, gets intercepted by this verge. So that feeds the tree, and it also lessens the burden of surface water runoff into the gully systems. And again, in Portugal, Lisbon, they have grass verges. This is just outside Lisbon. But in London, all we ever get, the closest we get to a verge in London, is a small rectangular piece of open ground next to where we plant the trees. So I've been talking about the different types of verges we can have. We have grass verges, and about how even these tiny fragments of green space in a city are quite highly sought after. Although this is by a canal, so it's not by a street, but it's this idea that even this very, very narrow strip of land becomes very, very attractive to either a local picnicker or this guy here who's just sunbathing in his lunch break. So the sort of joy, the aspect of, this concept of greening the city, it's that the joyfulness of vegetation, if you like, in all its forms, whether it's grass or trees or shrubs, is very fundamental to the way we enjoy or engage with our cities. Now, even in Paris, this is in central Paris, in a place called the Marais, which is a sort of essentially I think an old medieval layout. There's still enough space, or there's still found enough space to these planted verges. And again, these are doing all the things I talked about. They're managing surface water runoff, they're providing greenery, they're providing biodiversity, they're managing the heat island effect, and they're just looking nice, and they're providing people with a sense of joy or delight when they're walking around the city. And in Amsterdam, they've gone one step further. They've almost turned some of their street systems and their tramway systems and their footway and cycle networks into parkland by using the verge. So the verge becomes a component which is essentially as a park-like quality. So it feels as if you're moving through a park as opposed to moving through a city. And again, traffic islands in Paris, planted rather than hard paved. Or in Amsterdam, using it as a structural component so that the verge becomes a hedge, and the hedge helps to provide a little bit of separation from the carriageway, from the footway and the cycle lane. So you have this spatial separation that the verge starts to deal with. And again, these floating verges become islands, if you like, for planting. As an example, in Hackney, I mean, London's quite negative about London compared to some of our European cities, but little fragments of floating verge in London, which are again doing all these, having all these beneficial effects. This is a verge in Hackney, which was converted by the community. This used to be paved from building line to curb line. What they came along and did is dig up the paving. I don't know if you're familiar with this idea of depaving, but they depaved half of their footway, and they planted all these variety of different trees and shrubs. But it's very the character is very homemade. It's what's called guerrilla landscaping. So they just come in, do it, and it's there, and it starts to work. And then the final type, really, which is starting to interest me a little bit more, is this idea of the gravel verge. We've seen the ones in Copenhagen, we've seen the ones in Italy, and luckily now they're starting to be introduced into London. This is a scheme around Euston Road, and rather than the default position would normally be to pave from the edge of what's the underpass across to the footway. But instead of doing that, the design has been quite clever, and they've only paved where they need to pave, where people are walking, and the rest of it is essentially a verge. So this material is porous, or at least permeable. It allows water to percolate down into the root systems and feed the trees. It stops the water going into the Victorian surface water sewer system, and it's cheap. So local authorities are spending £150 on this material, and they're spending 25 quid a square metre on this material. So there's a big cost saving to be made as well from this kind of soft verge approach. Again, just more details really from the Paris situation. I'm back in London, and what I'm trying to do. I'm a designer, so I'm involved in a project around Brighton Station. And throughout Brighton, we try to introduce these gravel verges. Now, this one's just by the station. It's been taken over by the local shop, and they've kind of used it as an advertising hoarding. But there's a couple of trees to go in here and here, so this stuff will probably move out. And there's an opportunity as well that they can come along later, just dig all this gravel out and put some planting if they want to. So it gives you there's a great sort of flexibility then in how you access these little spaces within the public realm. And there's I don't know if you're familiar with there's big movements about urban food growing. These give opportunities for that to take place. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept of SUDS, but sustainable urban drainage. And there are certain verges do it in a sort of what I call SUDS light way. So the water that runs off from this side across to the carriageway is being intercepted by the verge. But there are some verges which deal with it in a more overt way. So this looks like a typical grass verge, but in fact, It's a grass verge which has a soakaway at the back of it, and it allows an access to the soakaways going through these holes in the curbstones. So it's a very, very discreet way of, again, this is managing carriageway water, not footway water. This is zooming even further to a very, very fine detail in a park in Edinburgh. So all the water is being shed by its granite paving, is moving across this way, and it gets intercepted by this very, very thin soakaway drain. And that drain allows the water to percolate into the subsoil, and it starts to feed the grass. And again, all of this water is then not going into the main sewerage system. And then, this gets slightly more esoteric, I suppose. This idea, what I've really been talking about is that these verges that occur on footways. Now, there are also verges which can occur on the edge of carriageways. Now, I'm going back to residential streets here, but most residential streets are essentially parked, you see, both sides of the road for most of their time. You know, there's no one ever drives up and down these bits. No one ever walks up and down those bits. No one ever cycles up and down those bits because they're always parked. So this is an example of in Glasgow. I don't know if you're aware, but most of the sort of roads in Victorian times were detailed in these granite sets. And what we tended to do is to just pave over them, asphalt over them. Now, a lot of these granite sets were loose jointed, so it means that water falling on here, some of it can percolate down into the subsoils as a natural system, and some of it, the overrun, if you like, gets taken off into the gully system. But all the time, this is reducing the amount of water that's getting into the sewerage system. And what's quite clever about this is that, again, if you look at the London example, the whole of this road is surfaced in asphalt, which has a cost to it, you know. In Glasgow, they're only surfacing approximately half the road, and the rest of it, so they're saving half the money of the resurfacing works by not resurfacing the edges, if you like. And then the edges, not only look a little bit nicer, they're also porous, and they allow vegetation to grow. Now, you know, this vegetation you might describe as a weed, but in fact, what it's doing is photosynthesizing, which all vegetation does. And photosynthesis has all these positive benefits, which, you know, without it we can't, as a race, we can't survive, because we need that oxygen exchange from carbon dioxide. So I'm advocating this kind of looser, if you like, arrangement of our public realm to allow fractures which allow water to percolate into it and allow vegetation to grow as well in places that you might not normally expect it. This is a slight jump, but have I got time? Yeah, I'm okay for time. It's a related idea, but it will sort of make sense, I think, as I come back to it. I don't know if you're familiar with this idea of decluttering. But what it is, this is a very famous picture by a guy called Ben Hamilton Bailey, who was appalled at how much crap we put in our streets. You know, stuff that we thought was necessary but isn't really necessary. It's duplication of signage. You know, it's all this pedestrian guard railing which is doing absolutely nothing for anyone. You know, it makes the idea of pedestrian guard railings is it makes places safer for pedestrians, but in fact it makes it more dangerous. You know, we can demonstrate that drivers drive faster through these environments because of the guardrail than they would if it wasn't there. So out of this idea of taking away all the stuff we don't need, there came out this concept called decluttering. And decluttering is in itself a very, very noble activity, or a noble gesture to improving the quality of our public realm. But what it tended to do, this is a project I worked on, is it tended us to think about streets in a very, very minimal way. So we went from this, which is just signage, traffic lights, guard railing everywhere, to what I call the new minimalism, which is this idea that our streets are completely empty and devoid of all this clutter. And it produced this the same idea about the minimal or the decluttered has transferred itself into public space design. So what you tend to get is big empty spaces. You get big empty streets with nothing in them. You get big empty spaces. I mean, on the one hand, these are described as, you know, low maintenance, efficient, clean. But in reality, these are sterile, dead spaces. You know, there's a public space here. There's nowhere to sit. You know, we have 2 or 3 trees in this space. All this hard paving is not allowing any water to percolate into the subsoils and feed the trees. It's not like it's all being managed within the Victorian sewerage system. So it's putting an increased burden on these systems, and they're now failing. So this idea of this new minimalism, if you like, manifests itself most perfectly in what I call the corporate aesthetic. This gets a little bit esoteric now, but just bear with me. So the corporate aesthetic, we've all seen it. These are public spaces that are managed by private institutions. So this is a space in the City of London, which is managed by a bank. And you can tell why it's managed by not say a bank, but any kind of institution. Here's a security guard. He's not a policeman. He's a security guard because this is all private property. Now that has a set of different implications, in that you're not on public land anymore. You're not free to do what you want. You're free to do what these people tell you to do. But within that, and I'm talking now as a designer of these kind of spaces, these again are very clean and empty. They've been decluttered. So that idea of the decluttering I was talking before has started to manifest itself in our public spaces and our streets. So its corporate aesthetic is starting to spread across our city. These empty, decluttered, sterile spaces are spreading across our city, and they're being managed as set-piece landscapes by big financial institutions usually. And they, you know, it's not just the UK. This is happening in Paris. It's happening in all the European cities. You know, it's happening across the world really. It's even happening in public spaces. This is the council, sorry, the council offices in Doncaster in South Yorkshire, where I'm from. So you're getting this same kind of sterile, clean, corporate aesthetic being transferred to public spaces. So there's nowhere, excuse me, there's nowhere for the water to percolate. There's no greenery. There's no kind of delight in these spaces. They're just big, empty, paved spaces. And then in opposition to that is this thing called what I call the guerrilla aesthetic. So you have the corporate. It's money. It's expensive, and it's in a way it's not inclusive. But the guerrilla aesthetic is everything that's not. It's the opposite of that. So it's homemade, it's cheap, it's quick, it's unregulated. So all that happens is you come in, dig up your pavement, plant some trees. You suddenly got a much better environment to socialise in, or to, as these guys are doing, have a beer. And it has all these benefits for biodiversity, water management, etc., etc. So this guerrilla aesthetic, it's very crude. It's very anti the corporate aesthetic, you know. But it's easy for us all to do it though. You know, the depaving movement in America is all about just digging up pavements that we don't need and crushing up the stone, chucking that away, using it as a sub base, and planting things. You know, taking as much paving away as we possibly can. And this is one of the first kind of guerrilla actions I think that happened in Hackney about 25 years ago by a friend of mine. He just came along and literally dug a hole and planted a tree. Now, it's really, really crude. And this is a street, you know, this is a street in Hackney with big holes in the ground with trees planted in it. But you know, these trees are now valuable assets to this local ecosystem because they're growing, they're providing habitat, they're dealing with surface water, they're managing, they're improving air quality, all these things that these trees are just, they've just been put in. And then, so you've got these two, what I like to think of conflicting ideologies. You've got the corporate ideology, and you've got the guerrilla ideology. And they come together, as Marx predicted, in this kind of synthesis. So there's a new ideology that comes out of these two conflicts. And I'm sort of loosely calling it the ecological aesthetic. And that's a bit, I'm just sort of playing around with words a little bit here, but trying to find a new way of thinking about how our streets and public spaces should look, which isn't corporate, which is a little bit more sophisticated than the guerrilla. So it has a little bit more thought about it. And the key components of the ecological aesthetic are that everything isn't perfect. This is going back to this verge idea I was talking about before. So fundamental to the ecological aesthetic is the idea that it doesn't matter if some of these grass verges are a little bit worn or they get a little bit muddy. You can never have this in the corporate environment because it's not quite perfect. So this would get ripped out and it would be re-turfed, and the turf would be watered every day. There'd be a lot of energy and money going into that watering process. But the ecological aesthetic says you don't need to do that. It's fine to have a muddy or a half-part muddy verge. It says it's fine to detail parking areas, which are not trafficked. You don't need to hard pave parking areas to allow, so the water falls on there, goes straight into the ground. It starts to feed these trees that are dotted around this parking area. Again, it looks a bit messy, but messy is part of the ecological aesthetic. It's fine. Again, it's about reusing materials. So these are old curbstones that we found in Brighton, and we chopped them all up and we use them in loading bays. These need to be quite. These are all concreted in, contrary to what I was saying before, because these take very big, heavy lorries. You can see the oil drips here. But it's about reusing materials, not buying new ones all the time. And there's a tiny little fragment of, again, this idea that this tiny little space in a Brighton street has been, they preserved the verge. They've managed to get a little bit of grass growing. The tree's been growing for 30, 40 years. They've managed to get a little bit of grass growing on this verge. It makes such a difference to that little street. And the final idea, which really is this idea about fractures, and it's related to this idea about mess as well. So it's not necessary to completely seal the surface of the earth, essentially, or even in our cities. Even in our cities, we can allow tiny little holes to emerge because the tiny little holes allow water through, and the tiny little holes allow plants to establish themselves and again, these plants, there's not many, they're small, but they're photosynthesizing. And they're doing all the things that plants do, which have a beneficial effect. And they do it in a very, very low-key, simple way. And we can still use, these surfaces can still be structural, they can still support the weight of traffic. But where they don't need to be smooth, they don't need to be solid, they don't need to be consistent, so they can be fractured. And this, you look at this fracture, you can start to see the types of, there's an ecosystem there emerging, which is very, very fine grained. The mosses and the small flowers and the grasses are all kind of growing together, and you can never get that with asphalt. You can never get that with granite or concrete, And it's doing exactly the same job of some of those parking areas I was showing you before, but it's more permeable. And again, sort of been quite negative about London, but there are some very positive things happening in London. This is, again, that idea that I talked about Glasgow. This is a street in Hackney which has been, again, they're not asphalting over the whole thing. They're allowing the old sets to emerge as parking areas. And again, these sets have gaps. Water can percolate, grass can grow, moss can grow. So there's this very fine-grained ecology emerging within these really, really hard urban areas. And we should be, we should, as designers, I should be supporting, or I am supporting this idea. Again, because these aren't mortared in, they're jointed. They're like a grit joint in these sets, and there's allowing vegetation to grow. Even these tiny little bits of gaps in our city where we just have one small little hole to plant a tree. There's a little bit of photosynthesis happening around the base, just a little bit of plants, and they're fine, Hopefully they'll spread and the whole thing will become green. So what I'm advocating really is a new street typology, but it's more of a new urban street typology, because we've had, in our suburban streets, we've had the verge in some form or other for a long time. I mean, in Islington they've been concreting them over, and other boroughs have been leaving them. But what I'm advocating here is that in our urban, and even in our very intensely used urban streets, this is near Tottenham Court Road, that we start to reintroduce the verge. The verge, can take the form of the gravel or the grass or the planted. And this idea that this material here, this permeable gravel material, it's very simply laid. It's costing, as I said before, a quarter or a fifth or even a sixth of the price of this granite paving to either side of it, but it still works in every single way you'd want a footpath to work in. You can still walk across it, but it just does so much more for the ecology of this environment than it would if it was hard paved. It gives these existing big old London plays a chance to get some more water and a chance to kind of continue to flourish. And one of the interesting things about this is a street in Lambeth where we persuaded the council not to repave the whole thing. They say, look, you've just paved half of it. It's a residential street. You rarely get two people walking down the street at the same time. Why are you going to pave the whole thing? Just pave half of it for where you need to run with your buggies, where you need to walk, and the rest of it, turn it into a verge. Now this verge might not stay in this form. It may be planted up. There's a movement in Lambeth called the Edible Bus Stop campaign, and they go along with fine fragments of depaved surface in the city, and they plant it with foodstuffs you can grow. Oh, sorry, foodstuff you can grow it with stuff you can eat. So there's vegetables and fruit and things like that in these environments. So it gives that possibility. And again, going back to that Brighton example, by just simply always putting a verge in, you give the opportunity for other things to happen. This cafe had started to colonise this space a little bit. We're going to put a tree in here and a tree in there, and someone might come along and these might come along and plant it. But even if it just stays as it is, it's still better than being concrete. The concrete's good because it's nice and flat and hard to wheel things along, but no water can get through. So the water moves that way and it percolates through there. It doesn't go into the carriageway. It doesn't go into the drainage system. So all these tiny little things have a cumulative effect. And I suppose the sort of final manifest, or the kind of end point in a way, or the ultimate verge, if you like, is the verge that can. This is a project we're trying to work again in Brighton, but it's slightly more sophisticated. Is the idea that these planted verges here are also managing. They're managing carriageway runoff. So they're taking water off the carriageway and they're processing it and purifying it before it goes back into the groundwater and then gets taken up into the natural systems. So this is the kind of ultimate verge, if you like. It's a verge with planting, which deals with managing pollutants and managing surface water, and also allows you to plant a decent structure of trees.